The fishing dock lay in dense fog, its wooden planks damp and cool underfoot. Old Mr. Lee sat at one end, his weathered hands holding a line that disappeared into the mist. Across from him, by an old lantern post, stood Yuki, her arms wrapped around herself as if warding off the chill. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Yuki said quietly, not expecting much of a response. Mr. Lee nodded slowly and kept his eyes on the water, where something flashed briefly before disappearing again. "Did you catch anything?" she asked after a moment. "No fish today," he replied, his voice soft but steady. Yuki moved closer to the rail and looked out over the fogged waters, which seemed to stretch endlessly. The dock creaked softly beneath them with each swell of the tide. She thought about her own day spent stitching torn clothes for villagers, the thread sometimes catching on rough patches as she worked. "Do you ever think back?" Yuki asked, breaking the silence that had settled around them. Mr. Lee looked up at her then, a small smile playing at his lips. "Often," he said simply. They both turned to face the murky expanse in front of them. It was impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. "Did you have dreams?" Yuki prompted gently, curious about what might come next from this quiet man. He paused for a long time before answering. "Yes, but those were long ago." Mr. Lee shifted slightly and pulled the fishing line toward him, examining his bait as if it had never seen before. Yuki stepped closer to stand beside him, her breath misting in front of her face. She reached out tentatively and touched his shoulder. It was cold beneath her hand. "You miss it?" she asked softly. Mr. Lee looked at her then with eyes that seemed older than the fog itself. "Sometimes," he said after a while, but there was no sadness in his voice. Yuki nodded thoughtfully and pulled back her hand to tuck loose strands of hair behind her ears. She watched him for another minute before turning away again towards the edge of the dock. "I'm going home now," she told him without looking back. Mr. Lee nodded, though Yuki couldn't see it from where she stood. "Thank you," he said quietly into the fog. Yuki hesitated at the end of the dock, feeling a slight breeze brush against her cheek. She turned again to look over her shoulder at Mr. Lee, who was staring out once more towards nothingness beyond the fog. She waved gently and stepped off the edge of the boardwalk onto solid ground below. With each step she took away from the dock, she felt lighter somehow, as if she had left some small burden behind with Mr. Lee. As the sound of her footsteps faded into silence along with his fishing lines pull through the water, only the soft patter of raindrops began to fall softly over everything in its path.
You're listening to the Empty Teahouse. The lonely shadow of the lantern post stretched across damp planks as Yuki departed. In the soft glow of paper lanterns, Lee and Chin sit in a teahouse enveloped by the quiet night.
In the waning light of dusk, beneath the soft glow of paper lanterns hanging from the eaves, Lee and his old friend Chin sit across a small table in the teahouse. The room is quiet except for the murmur outside where the wind rustles through leaves and distant conversations weave together like threads. Chin pours hot water over green tea leaves. "How was your journey back?" he asks without looking up, waiting until the steam rises and settles before setting down the kettle. "It was long," Lee answers simply. He watches Chin pick out a single leaf that escaped and floats to the surface. The older man picks it up gently with his fingers, holds it between thumb and forefinger for a moment, then lets it drift away again into the cup. Lee's eyes follow its path. "I didn't expect to see you here," he says after a pause, stirring his tea slowly as if it were time itself. "Unexpected things often happen when we least expect them," Chin remarks softly, lifting his own cup and sipping quietly. They sit in comfortable silence for some minutes, the only sound the occasional clink of teacups or the rustle of customers entering and exiting beyond the open door. Outside, night is coming early tonight with dark clouds rolling in from the mountains far away. "Have you thought much about?" Lee starts, but trails off before he can find the right words to ask his question. Chin sets down his cup with a small thud that seems too loud against the quiet of the tea house. Chin smiles faintly, nodding slightly as if he's heard more than just those unfinished words. It's hard to say, he admits after another moment of silence. He picks up one of their empty saucers and turns it over in his hands like a small world resting on its rim, then sets it down. Lee studies Chun, watching him turn the cup again as if each side shows something different, though none ever quite clear enough to grasp firmly. After a while, Lee reaches out hesitantly, stops just short of touching the saucer with his fingers, and lets them drop back into his lap. Chun looks up then, meeting Lee's gaze directly for once. His eyes hold the weight of many sunrises and sunsets in their depths. "Do you know what I think about?" he asks softly. "I think that everything is just passing through." The words hang between them as another customer enters with a clatter of shoes and sets down money on the counter, breaking the moment. Lee picks up his cup again and takes a sip, feeling its warmth seep into him like a quiet embrace against the growing chill outside. He sets it back down slowly, watching steam rise from inside and dissipate into the evening air around them. Outside now, rain begins to fall gently against the tea house roof, each drop making tiny circles and puddles forming on the ground beyond the lantern light. The room grows cooler with the weather's change, but also somehow warmer in a way Lee can't quite name yet. Chun looks out too for a moment, then back at Lee again. "It changes," he says finally, almost as if to himself, or perhaps simply confirming something old and true that needs no further explanation. Lee nods slowly, feeling the weight of his teacup in his hand heavier now somehow, even though not a drop has been added since it was last filled. He looks back at Chin one more time, then turns his eyes toward the window where rain taps steadily against glass like countless tiny fingertips. Outside grows dark faster than expected, with clouds thickening overhead and night closing around them tighter. The tea house fades into shadow, but for a few flickering lanterns hanging here and there, and the warm glow of tea lights set inside each cup on their table, casting shadows long and quiet under dim light.
Rain tapped out its steady rhythm on the roof where Chen's conversation had faded to whispers. The wind blew through an orchard at dusk, leaves rustling underfoot as Lee walked among silent trees.
A late autumn wind blew through the orchard where the apples had long since fallen. Leaves rustled underfoot as Lee walked among the trees, her boots crunching softly on the damp earth. She paused by a single persimmon tree heavy with fruit and reached up to pluck one ripe orange gem. Lee's neighbor, Ming, was waiting in his courtyard nearby. He greeted her with a nod, offering her a chair under the persimmon tree's canopy where she could rest for a while. Lee placed her bag beside her as she sat down, unwrapping the fruit to savor its sweetness slowly. Ming busied himself fetching a cloth and bucket of water from his well. He wiped the dirt off a small table set between them before sitting quietly across from Lee. She watched him with a soft smile, grateful for his company on this windy day. After a while, Ming asked, "Did you see that old oak fall over near the river?" "It's been there since I was a boy." Lee nodded thoughtfully. "A good tree dies and another takes its place. Like our lives," she said simply. Ming poured water into 2 cups and handed one to Lee. She accepted it without words, sipping the cool liquid slowly as he spoke about his plans for next year's planting season. His voice was steady, but his hands showed signs of aging, lines creasing the backs like tiny rivers. They sat in companionable silence for a time before Lee asked if she could take a look at Ming's new pottery wheel. He led her into his workroom where clay lay spread out on boards and wheels spun slowly to demonstrate how the pots took shape under practiced hands. "Each turn of the wheel is different," he explained, pointing to the slightly misshapen vessel beside him. "We try our best, but we cannot control every twist." Lee nodded, her eyes lingering over the clay bowl as if she were seeing its future form in her mind's eye. They both knew it was an imperfect mirror of all creation. Outside again, Lee stood by the persimmon tree considering a last fruit still hanging on for dear life against the wind's relentless push. Ming watched her, then nodded toward the nearby woodpile where he had laid out some old newspapers and kindling ready to be burned later that day when the cold sets in. Lee's eyes followed his gesture and she understood. She walked over, picking up a single sheet of newspaper, tucking it carefully into her bag as if to keep its message or simply for warmth against coming winter days. As Lee prepared to leave, Ming handed her another persimmon wrapped in twine from his garden harvest. "For the road," he said with a warm smile. She accepted it without hesitation, turning back once before she left to wave gently as if bidding farewell to more than just an orchard at dusk.
The lantern flame swayed once, steadying in the calm of a loom's rhythmic dance behind her shop. At dusk, beneath the soft light of another hanging lantern, she sits while outside, the wind whispers through an orchard's bare branches.
At dusk, in the soft light of a lantern hanging from the porch roof behind her shop, an old widow sat quietly on a wooden stool. Her fingers moved deftly through rows of colorful threads spread out before her. Each strand seemed to hold its own breath, waiting patiently for the loom's rhythm. Across the narrow cobblestone alley stood a small boy with dusty shoes and hands as rough as bark from days spent sweeping a nearby courtyard. He paused by the edge of the porch where shadows began to thicken into night's cloak. His eyes darted nervously, unsure if he should enter or retreat back into the gathering darkness. "Come here," she called gently, without looking up from her work. "Stay a while." The boy stepped hesitantly onto the creaking boards, his feet moving one after another, as if each step required a separate thought to be made possible. He leaned against the wooden wall by the door and watched her hands move. "You don't have much time," she said softly, nodding towards his dusty clothes and swollen knuckles. "I can see it in your eyes." He nodded mutely, afraid of words but wanting them too. The widow set aside her tools and turned to face him fully for the first time. Her gaze was warm yet sharp. "Do you know why I weave these cloths?" she asked without waiting for an answer. She picked up a strip of fabric showing intricate patterns, a snake intertwined with a bird, symbols he couldn't quite decipher but somehow felt familiar. "To keep people from being cold," he guessed after a moment's hesitation. She smiled slightly at his innocent logic and let the cloth drape over her lap like a second skin. "And to remind them that what they wear is a story of their past, and it tells us who we are becoming." The boy's eyes flickered across the room to where shelves lined with rolls of fabric leaned against the walls. Colors danced in his vision, reds of love and loss, blues of sorrow and peace. "Do you want to try?" she offered, holding out a piece of string. Slowly, almost reverently, he accepted it from her fingers. The thread felt cool beneath his fingertips, like the river that ran through town where he often went to wash away grime and worries. He looked up at her expectantly now that something had been given into his hands. "Let's see what your story will be," she said softly, watching closely as he struggled with the first knots. Each mistake made him flinch back from the fabric like he feared tainting it with imperfection. After a few moments of fumbling, frustration etched deeper lines around his mouth. She reached out gently, showing him how to weave through existing threads rather than battling them alone. Her fingers moved over his own in patient guidance until they worked together seamlessly. Outside, the night deepened into midnight blue, punctuated only by twinkling stars peeking shyly from between clouds like curious children. Inside, time slowed and stretched beyond normal bounds under this soft light of lanterns and shared breath. When he finally stepped away from her loom, his face was wet with tears that seemed to speak louder than words ever could have done. In the quiet space between them, now filled solely by their silent acknowledgement of something exchanged unseen, but no less profound, she handed him a small wrapped gift sitting beside her stool, a wooden ring carved into the shape of an infinity symbol. He looked at it, then back up at her without speaking again. The gesture said all he needed to say, and perhaps more than could be put into words anyway. As dawn broke over rooftops and birds began their morning song outside, she waved him off quietly with no fanfare or farewells. Only a warm nod acknowledging the bond formed by threads held briefly in both of their hands. He left knowing that sometimes stories are woven not just out of yarn, but also out of silences shared.
Again, the lantern flame steadies itself as the old widow turns to thread her final strand of color into her fabric. Noon falls in silence over rice paddies near a village where Kimiko and her grandson work together by a small stream.
At noon, when the rice paddies near the village are silent and still except for the occasional rustle of wind through dry stalks, an old woman named Kimiko sits by a small stream. Her hands rest on her lap, gnarled from years of harvesting and threshing. Nearby, her grandson, a boy of 7 with curly hair and round cheeks, struggles to carry a large basket across the field. "Grandma," he says, dropping to his knees beside her, "this is too heavy." Kimiko looks up at him, then smiles gently without speaking. She rises slowly from the grass, dusting off her skirt. The boy watches as she takes the basket from him, setting it down carefully near a small tree that bends slightly under its burden of late summer fruit. "Why do you keep working so hard?" he asks, his voice tinged with worry and love. She glances at him, then back to the rice paddies. "I know what it's like," she says, looking into the distance where a row of mountains meets the horizon. Her eyes are tired but kind. The boy takes her hand, squeezing softly. Together they walk towards their home in silence. The weight of the basket presses against Kimiko's shoulders as she moves, each step deliberate and slow. At the door to their house, Kimiko stops and kneels beside a small potted plant that has begun to wilt. She carefully removes some dead leaves and sprays water onto the soil. The boy watches her tend to the withering plant, seeing how tenderly she handles it despite its unyielding nature. "Why do you save things when they're dying?" he asks. Kimiko smiles without looking up from her task. "To show them there's still hope," she says quietly. Inside their modest home, Kimiko starts preparing a simple meal while the boy plays quietly in the corner with his toys. The smell of rice cooking fills the room as sunlight streams through a small window onto the floor. After dinner, the grandfather who lives with them joins them by the fireplace. He tells old stories about his youth and travels, speaking softly so not to wake their sleeping neighbors. Kimiko listens intently, her eyes reflecting each memory he shares. The boy sits between them, listening but also drawing a picture in the dust of the hearth. When the grandfather's voice quiets for a moment, he speaks up. "Why do you keep talking about things that happened long ago?" His grandfather turns to look at him, then smiles kindly. "To show we're still here," he says. In the quiet after his words, Kimiko reaches over and takes the old man's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. She lets go slowly, their eyes meeting for a moment before returning to watch the flames dancing against the logs. Outside, as darkness falls, the boy helps his grandmother collect more firewood, while his grandfather prepares their beds by the hearth for the night. They sit together in comfortable silence after they finish, the room warm and filled with the lingering scent of wood smoke and cooked rice. Before turning off the light by her bed, Kimiko pulls a worn blanket up to cover herself and her husband. She reaches over to adjust his pillow, arranging it just so before laying down beside him. As she closes her eyes, her hand gently rests on his shoulder, holding him close in the darkness. The only sound is the slow breathing of sleep, the rhythmic ticking of a small clock, and an occasional crackle from the fireplace. The room grows still as they drift off, the quiet world outside pressing in through the shadows that gather around them.
The clock's soft chime floats momentarily before settling back into stillness, echoing softly through the empty tea house. The empty tea house rests. Until tomorrow.